Okay, also want to mention, of course, today we have our care group reorganization dinner immediately after morning service, but have actually a busy week coming up. Ladies' Day is Saturday, right? It's coming Saturday. So Ladies' Day is Saturday for you ladies. And don't forget, Kirby Pines is a week from today. So for those of you that normally like to attend Kirby Pines, and we'll be worshiping with those folks next Sunday. All right, we're in Philippians chapter 1, and we've noticed the salutation from Paul to this church that he loved so much and took so much joy in and from. And now we were in the midst of studying this prayer, verses 3 through 11. And verses 3 through 5, we looked at Paul's thanksgiving. And in 6 through 8, we noticed his, for I guess lack of a better title, confidence in God's Word and how that he would complete this good work in them. And how they were taking part and participating with him in his chains or bonds and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. So now we get to we just started verses 9 through 11, the last part of this prayer, in which he prays for their, I guess for lack of a better term, their spiritual growth. And this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in knowledge and all discernment, that you may approve the things that are excellent, that you may be sincere and without offense till the day of Christ, being filled with the fruits of righteousness which are by Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. We mentioned, I think already, right before we left last week, we'll notice that he said he prayed that their love may abound still more and more, and notice that it could abound in knowledge and all discernment. And when you read the Bible, you never see love as common. You don't see any commendation for this concept of love that we have in our modern world, of just kind of this unguided emotion. Love is generally connected, or it is educated, if you will, when we read about love in the Scriptures. And so love, he prays that it will grow within these channels of knowledge and discernment. And so in our day and age, sometimes love is seen as a substitute maybe for soundness and doctrine. Well, it doesn't really matter what you believe as long as what? Well, as long as we all love one another, whatever that means, love one another and get along. But that's not the way the Bible defines love, and our love has to be educated. We have to have this spiritual judgment or discernment to know between what's right and wrong and between truth and error. And then he goes on to say that you may approve the things that are excellent. That phrase in English is apparently a long word in the Greek, but different commentators use different phrases. Recognize the highest and best, distinguish differences, testing things that are differ, enabling you to have a sense of what is vital. The NIV says discern what is best. And so the bottom line is there are some things in life that are more important than others, right? And certainly spiritual truths are the most important. Those things that pertain to God and our walk with Him. And so He wants them to be able, and us, to be able to prove the things that are excellent, those things that are best. And I think as we left last week, I mentioned there are other scriptures in the New Testament that talk about approving or proving or putting things to the test. For instance, the sincerity of our love, 1 Corinthians 8:8. Our own selves, 2 Corinthians 13:5. prove all things, hold fast to that which is good, 1 Thessalonians 5:21. So we see these kind of exhortations from the Holy Spirit through Paul on several occasions. And then he says that you may be sincere. Now that's an interesting word, and you really get there's a couple of directions that commentators go on this word because of the Greek. It can mean a couple of different things. One, and it's translated in 2 Peter 3:1 as pure, where it has the idea of unmixed. And that's because part of this word, they believe, comes from a root word which means to whirl around and around as in a sieve. And so you're sifting out the impurities. And so a person, he wants them to be pure or unmixed. Now another idea is that it comes from a word, helios, which talks about the warmth or light of the sun. So that in other words, it's tested by the sun, meaning that our behavior is able to withstand the test of sunlight. You know, there's certain passages in the New Testament talk about people that are involved in evil and immoral activity generally engage in that when? At night, right, when you can't be seen because there are shameful things they're up to. And so the question is our behavior pure? And that's what really you could translate the word sincere as pure. Is it unmixed? But also, can it withstand the light of day? If somebody were to, it's kind of like the old analogy to cockroaches, right? You know, what happens when you walk into a room or in your garage, you flip on the light, and all of a sudden you see this thing's taking off because they don't like light. So can our lives withstand that kind of scrutiny? And so sincere and without offense till the day of Christ. That is, we've talked about before, the day of His coming, the final judgment, and so forth. Being filled with the fruits of righteousness, which are by Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. I like what Brother Jackson said in his little commentary on this word, or this phrase, this Greek word, be filled. He says it's in a perfect tense, passive voice, meaning it's an abiding state of spiritual activity, but the passive voice indicates that the fruits are not the result of meritorious accomplishment. In other words, we know that we don't earn our salvation, and yet, according to Ephesians 2, we've been created for what? You know, even though we're saved by grace through faith, we're created for what and to do what? Yeah, to be engaged in good works. And so He wants them to be filled with these fruits of righteousness, which are by Jesus Christ, obviously that come from a life that's submissive to Christ, to the glory and praise of God. And really that gets down to that little phrase is the ultimate goal when you ask the question, why do I exist? Why does man exist? And we exist, the glory and praise of God is the only abiding and true endeavor of all human activity. And that's why He created us. And so we read verses like that we were made for His glory in Isaiah 43:7 or Ecclesiastes 12:13. What? This is sometimes we say the whole duty, but really the text reads there the whole of man. Right, is to fear God and keep His commandments. And so that's what it's all about, really. To be filled with the fruits of righteousness, which are by Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. And when you think about it, if we're going to be like Christ, as we leave this section, what did Christ always say His purpose was? Especially when you go into the book of John, what did He say? My will is what? Yeah, to do the will of Him that sent me, right? I mean, that's what He was all about. And so if we're going to be like Him, that's what we're to be all about. Well, now we're going to talk a little bit in verses 12 through 26 about Paul's present circumstances. And we'll read this little short section, verses 12 through 14. But I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Well, obviously there's an indication there. Paul had this close relationship with these people. And so obviously they would be concerned about his present state. I mean, they knew, he was in Rome. They knew he was in custody. That's why they sent Epaphroditus with this gift that we'll talk about later in the book. And so, they would be anxious, wanting to know about, what's going on with him, and he knows that. He says, but I want you to know, and and the interesting thing about it is, as we see as the book goes along, because of their relationship, these people are concerned about Paul's circumstances, and Paul is concerned about what? Yeah, he's concerned about their anxiety. He doesn't want them to be anxious and worrying about him. And that's how close they were and the way they felt about one another. Now that term in the New King James and the King James furtherance is generally translated in more modern translations or other translation as progress, sometimes advance. It's interesting that Greek word literally means a striking forward. It combines two words that means forward and cut. And so there's the idea of somebody maybe cutting his way through, the brush or the jungle. You can picture somebody with a big machete or something, cutting his way through this undergrowth. And so that's the idea there, this progress, advance, or furtherance of the gospel. He's saying, hey, some people would see these things as a hindrance. They would see chains, and we know he's in chains because we've already looked at Ephesians 6 and Colossians 4 and Philemon. He's connected by a chain, usually to at least one guard. And some would see that, he's on the sidelines. And he says, no. This actually has turned out for the advance or progress of the gospel. And of course, we know from 1 Peter 4, there is no virtue in being in jail per se. Just like there's no virtue in being poor per se. There's no virtue in being in a lot of states in this life. The question is, why are you in that position? And if you're in jail because you did something wrong, well, then that's where you belong. But if you're in jail because Peter says you're suffering as a Christian, well, that's a whole nother matter. That's actually a blessing to be able to suffer for his name. At least that's the way the first century Christians and apostles felt about it. And notice he says that it has become evident to the whole palace guard. I think maybe the King James says Praetorian. This is that special group of Roman soldiers, and numbers vary. Perhaps as many as 10,000 of them that they were part of the emperor's personal bodyguard. And they were divided into regiments. I think I read somewhere between 600 to 900 men. And they were used in other parts of the empire, but generally speaking, they were most of them would have been headquartered in Rome. But it's a body of men. And notice, more than likely, now here Paul he's got to be chained to somebody. And I'm sure, obviously, they did this in shifts. So it makes you wonder how many of these guards, these Praetorian soldiers, got to listen to the gospel every day. Some of them probably appreciated it. Others were probably like, man, I got to go sit with this guy again and listen to him talk about the resurrection of this strange God that he's preaching. So they were a captive audience, so they didn't really have much choice. But nevertheless, the interesting thing is, it would seem to me that what he's saying here is, it's become evident to this whole Praetorian guard and to all the rest, that is, others there in Rome and perhaps even in the emperor's household, that he that the reason he's in chains is not because he's a bad man. I mean, look, these guys would have been able to assess this. Do you think that these Roman soldiers had seen some bad people in their time? You think they had killed and fought with a lot of tough men in their time and bad people and criminals? So it wouldn't have taken them long to be chained to Paul and figure out, you know what? This guy hadn't done anything bad. I mean, he's not a bad guy. It's obvious that he's in prison for what he believes and what he's preaching. And that's why he's here. So it was obvious to them. And so because of that, Paul says that, a lot of the brethren there in Rome are more bold now to speak. He says most of them are. Not all of them, but most of them are. And so they had gained some confidence from his circumstances that emboldened them to speak out and preach the gospel. Beginning of verse 15, some, he says, indeed preach Christ even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. 16 and 17 are interesting. Apparently in the oldest Greek texts, these verses are reversed from what you have if you're reading the New King James or the King James. If you're reading some other versions, they may actually have them reversed, but they read basically the same. They're just in reverse order. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition, and that's a good translation there of that word contention in the King James. It generally means selfishness. That Greek word means selfishness or selfish ambition. Not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains. But the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed, I think the King James says set, for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, these brethren now, most of them are more confident to preach because of what's happened to Paul. And by the way, and I skipped over it, but I don't want to skip over it too quickly. Go back to 14 where he says, most of the brethren what? What's that phrase after the word brethren? Huh? In the Lord? Do you have any brethren outside of the Lord? Do you have any spiritual brothers and sisters outside of the Lord? No. If they're actually your spiritual brothers and sisters, they're in the Lord. It's also interesting to me that he says most of them are now bold to speak the word without fear. And he's talking about those brethren in Rome. Well, that's what he said in Romans 1:8. Your faith is proclaimed throughout the whole world. But getting back to these two groups. One group's preaching the gospel out of proper motives and one out of improper motives, which is kind of weird. But that's the way we are sometimes. I think Scott said something about this in his lesson last Sunday, a little facetiously. But you never known a preacher to be envious or jealous of other preachers. Maybe this guy's getting a lot of credit. Let's bring it down to our day and age. Brother so-and-so, and look at it from a worldly eye rather than a spiritual eye. Paul looked at everything through a spiritual lens. Sometimes we can get caught up in looking at things through a worldly lens, and preachers can do this too. Because preacher A is envious of preacher B because preacher B has a better job than him, whatever that means. What does he mean by that? If preacher A says preacher B's got a better job, generally what's he saying from a worldly standpoint? It's a bigger congregation with more money to pay. Now, occasionally you might hear someone talk about the opportunities. That would really be the better job. More opportunities to reach the lost. I had an economics professor in college who was big into free enterprise and capitalism, and he used to talk about preaching, not necessarily members preachers that are members of the church, but he used to talk about these denominational preachers that are socialists, don't like capitalism. And he said it was always funny to me that whenever one of these fellows heard the call to go somewhere else, it was always for a bigger church with more money, They didn't like capitalism. They were big socialists, but when they heard the call, it was always for something, a little bit better monetarily for them. But even sometimes members of the Lord's church can be that way. Well, he's got a better job. He's on more lectureships. He gets more meetings. He's more well known in the brotherhood. We have to be careful of that. And apparently these fellows thought, well, here Paul's on the sidelines. This is our time. This is our opportunity, right? To make hay. And we'll be big shots, and people will know us, and they'll look to us. Paul said, that's okay. He said, he condemns their attitude and their motive, but apparently here, and this is the part that we really need to make sure we understand, is that apparently these guys were preaching what, though? What does he say? The former preach what? This is probably the point we need to get from this. That yes, they were preaching with the wrong motives, but what? They were preaching what? Christ. And if they're preaching Christ, what does that mean? Doesn't mean that they're just preaching about Him or who He is, but they're preaching what? They're preaching His doctrine. They're preaching His will. Go back to the Ethiopian eunuch. And Philip joined himself to the chariot, and the text says in Acts chapter 8 that he preached unto him what? Not exactly, but close. Actually, that verse says he preached unto him Jesus. That's all it says. He preached unto him Jesus. That's all the text says. And then all of a sudden they come to a certain water, and the Ethiopian eunuch says what? Here's water. Yeah. I want to be immersed. So obviously preaching Christ or preaching Jesus includes His will and all the things that it takes to obey and please Him. Well, that being said, then obviously these guys are not false teachers. Some might look at this and say, well, you see, Paul's okay with whatever you want to preach as long as the name of Christ is getting out there. We sometimes use that term Christendom for just religious groups in general that preach about Christ. That's not what Paul's saying. Apparently these fellows were teaching the truth, but obviously they were doing it with the wrong motivation. Sincerely, not sincerely. Well, we talked about that word before. That means not purely. Right? Mixed motives, impure motives, pretense. That word pretense is the word prophasis. And that means a false reason. That is, they're not being honest. And so again, disguising their motives. But their motive was to somehow hurt him. I guess they thought, evidently to me, these guys must think that Paul thinks like them. Isn't that the way we are? Isn't that the way worldly people are? Worldly people think other people think like them. So these guys think that if we preach and we become well known and famous and people start looking to us and this kind of thing, that what's that going to do to Paul? Since he thinks like us, that's going to hurt him. Because he's going to be upset that he's not the top dog anymore. And Paul says, no, that doesn't bother me. Because as Scott said in his lesson last week, if somebody preaches you the truth, even if their own life is not in order, or even if they don't have the right motive, if you accept the truth in its simplicity and sincerity, and honestly you accept it, doesn't matter about the guy that preached it to you. He's got to answer for himself. We're all going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. But you can still obey it. And of course, some were dedicated to Paul and to God. And they had the right motive. Notice he says, the latter out of love, knowing that I am set, the King James says, or appointed. That word, that Greek word actually in the passive sense has the idea of appointed or destined. And so it suggests that Paul is perhaps even saying here that it's the providence of God that I'm in this position. He's appointed me. He's destined me. I am here for this reason. All this good and advance and furtherance of the gospel, I see this as the hand of God. I see this as God's work. So, again, we have to always ask ourselves the question when I compare myself to Paul. If I was in prison, in his circumstance, stuck with a chain and a guard, would I see that? Would I rejoice in that and say, oh, well, this is, as long as the gospel is going forth and so forth, it's providence of God. Things are working out just fine here. It just seems to be Paul's attitude. Seems to be his attitude all the time. For the defense of the gospel, what then only in every way, whether in pretense or truth, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice and will rejoice. So, he censures their bad attitudes, but not what they were preaching. So, let's look at the next section. For I know that this will turn out for my salvation. I believe some translations say, New King James says, my deliverance. Through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness as always, so now also Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor, and yet what I shall choose I cannot tell. For I am hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. And being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy of faith, that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again. He says, I know that this shall turn out for my deliverance or my salvation. It's interesting here, and you can read as many commentators and scholars as you want to read on this. You're going to get differing opinions. One of two, and it could be either, based on the context, really. But for I know that this will turn out. Well, what's the this? Well, it would appear then that this advance of the gospel perhaps is what he's referring to. I mean, that's what he just talked about. But notice he says it will turn out for my deliverance or my salvation. So the question is, among commentators and scholars, is that his deliverance from his current state in prison? Or is that his ultimate deliverance or salvation? And really, to be honest, and I've read several, they can all point to something in this context to support their position. Because he says, he starts talking about that Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. And so there's this idea, well, he's talking about ultimately he's talking about his salvation, because whether he lives or dies, he's talking about whether he lives or dies. But then he goes on also in this context and talks about his actual release, and is really confident and believes that he's probably going to be released. And tradition tells us from history that he was released from this first imprisonment. So, I say all that to say that, it could work either one in this context. And you can do your own study on that. But either way, whether he's talking about his deliverance from prison or salvation in the sense of heaven, salvation in its highest sense, he talks about through their prayers and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. And that, of course, the Spirit of Jesus Christ would be reference to the Holy Spirit. And We know that he takes part in an intercessory role in our prayers. And so these people were praying for his deliverance. And notice he says that my body, no matter what happens to me, this is Paul's attitude, my body is going to be the theater upon which the glory of Christ is going to be displayed. I'm going to magnify him. If I live, I continue preaching. If I die, I will die a martyr's death, and others will see his glory, and they will be strengthened by that and by my courage and willingness to do that. And so, either way, that's okay. Whether life or death, whether I'm preaching or I'm condemned, I'm going to magnify him in my body. I mean, basically, Paul says Christ is the beginning. If you read this whole section, you just come away with the idea that Christ is the beginning and the end of life for Paul. It's everything to him. He's everything to him. I mean, he lives only to serve him. And I guess from that, what we take away is, or I guess maybe what I would take away from that, is that, once again, we're hit with the fact that Christianity is not a part-time job. And it's not a hobby. And it's not like taking up golf. But it is a, 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, 365-day-a-year deal. And that's why Jesus said, he gave the parable of the parables of the counting of the cost. When he said, hey, what king who has 10,000, doesn't sit down and decide, can he meet the guy that's coming at him with 20, or the guy that's going to build the tower, he doesn't sit down first and figure out whether he's got enough money to finish. That's what you're supposed to do when you talk about wanting to serve him and become a Christian. Am I willing to put into this what it takes? Yeah. Yeah. I think it not only keeps us from not being bothered, also keeps us out of trouble. It seems to me that some, not a lot, but a few preachers that get on what we call, what's the word you use, Brother Ted? Hobby horses? It seems to me that happens because they don't have the same focus. Instead of just being focused on their own work, with their own congregation and their own community, they get distracted. And they want to get involved in some, everybody else's business and fight some fight that may or may not even need fighting. And I think you're right. It's about focus. And if we're focused on him, then it probably keeps us out of other people's business, keeps us out of trouble, and gives us some peace of mind where we're not anxious and bothered by all this noise, as we talk about sometimes, about all the noise around us. So, good point. Notice he says to die is gain. In 2 Corinthians 5:8, he used the phrase, at home with the Lord. But there's obviously some emotional agony going on here. Back in verse 20, he talks about his earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed. And he talks about boldness, which is outspokenness, frankness, plainness of speech, one definition, but another definition also is courage or fearlessness. Paul, he wanted to have that fearless courage that would allow him to speak out and to speak plainly and not be scared to stand up for Christ and His Word. And that's something we all, I think, struggle with at times. But he's got this emotional agony going on. He's restricted on both sides. He's under pressure, which prevents him to make a definite choice. Some of the Greek scholars say this word "in a strait," I think the King James says, talks about hemmed in, pressed in on every side. Thayer says, "I am hard pressed on both sides. My mind is impelled or disturbed from each side." Lightfoot says, "I am hemmed in on both sides, prevented from inclining one way or the other." The New American Standard, "I am hard pressed from both directions." And that's what the New King James says here. I'm hard pressed between the two. I don't know which way to go, but what? If I had to choose, I mean, obviously being with Christ is far better than anything that this earth's got to offer, but to stay here is better for you, brethren, and other churches. More needful for you. And so it's kind of, he basically says in this unselfish attitude, it's really kind of God's call here. It'd be tough for me to choose, but I'm confident in His decision. And there's a calculation of probabilities that he's doing here that basically he finally comes to the conclusion that what? More than likely what's going to happen. And being confident of this, calculating these probabilities, I'm going to be released. I shall remain. In other words, I shall continue to live, remain in the flesh, and continue with you all for your progress and joy of faith, that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again, or by being with you again. That word coming is that word we see a lot in the New Testament, parousia, which is a lot of times used for the coming of Christ. It means presence, but he obviously anticipated release, and subsequent information from both the Bible and secular writers indicates that he was. Remember in Philemon 22, what did he tell Philemon to do? What did he tell him to do? Anybody recall verse 22 of that book? He told him to prepare a what? Didn't he say something about preparing a lodging? He was anticipating seeing him again. And that book, of course, was written about the same time as this one was. When Paul writes 1 Timothy, he mentions that he was going into Macedonia and he exhorted Timothy to remain at Ephesus, but scholars cannot fit that information into any of the missionary journeys recorded in Acts. And so they believe that to be something that happened after this release. Eusebius, historian of the 4th century, says, after pleading his case, he is said to have been sent again upon the ministry of preaching, and after a second visit to the city that he finished his life with martyrdom. Well, Eusebius in the 4th century was just rehashing or restating what the traditional view had come down to him was, and so there's no reason to doubt that Paul was released and able to make his way to Philippi again and see these folks. And then, of course, was arrested during the Neronian persecution for the second time, and then, wrote the book of 2 Timothy before his final martyrdom. So, we begin a series of exhortations. He's told us about his present circumstances and how that's affected him and others. And now he starts giving a series of exhortations to these brethren, beginning in verse 27. And he begins with an appeal for unity. And so there is some indication here, and we'll see it later in the book, that perhaps there was a little bit going on there. Nothing I wouldn't say colossal, but there obviously was a couple of sisters there. We're going to see that were having some issues. And so he addresses this subject of unity. Verse 27, only let your conduct, I think the King James there says conversation, and that's an interesting word, that Greek word, but let's read it and we'll come back. Let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast in one spirit with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, and not in any way terrified or affrighted by your adversaries, which is to them a proof of perdition or destruction, but to you of salvation, and that from God. For to you it has been granted on behalf of Christ not only to believe in Him, but also to suffer for His sake, having the same conflict which you saw in me, and now here is in me. Well, that word for conversation, and that's a good translation there, let your conduct be worthy, your manner of life, the way you live. But it's interesting, the root word from the Greek, I'm not even going to say it, the long word, but the root word comes from polites, which means, from which we get our word political, which means citizen. And so, and that word is used in several places in the book of Luke, but that word comes from the word polis, which means city, and that's from which we get our English word citizen. And the reason for that is Greece was originally organized as what? They didn't know anything about nations. They were city-states. So you weren't a citizen of a country, but of a city. And that's how that word developed. But here, this word literally means, and we're going to leave on this, this word literally means to live as a citizen, which is a huge deal to these people. Paul says, live your citizen life. We are a colony of heaven. This is a big deal to these people because they are what? What are they so proud of? That Philippi was what? It was a Roman colony, right? Probably a lot of retired soldiers there, self-governing. It was considered to be a copy, a little copy of Rome. These people were very proud of that. Paul says, you live your best citizen life. But your citizenship, according to chapter 3, verse 20 in this same book, is where? It's in heaven. Everybody in Philippi is proud of being a Roman citizen and living in a Roman colony. But guess what, Philippian brethren? Your citizenship is in heaven. So you live like that kind of citizen. That's the play there on the Greek, which would have meant a lot to these people. Okay, we'll pick up there next week.